And we're back on Consumer Choice Radio, coming to you on Saga 960 AM in the Peel region and the Big Talker 106.7 FM out of Wilmington, North Carolina. I have the pleasure of interviewing our next guest, who is an Afghan refugee herself and a senior consultant with Loyalist Public Affairs. Zahra Sultani, thank you very much for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio.
Thank you for having me.
So, I mean, you have your own attachment and perspective that's unique to many of us, being a refugee yourself. But just give our listeners a bit of a backstory on your experience leaving Afghanistan, what that was like for your family, when they left, and things like that.
So, when my parents left Afghanistan, I wasn't born yet. My father and my mom and some of my relatives left Afghanistan last time Taliban came around. So it's funny for me to now see others leave, because once again Taliban has taken Afghanistan. That was back in 1980s. My family, or late 80s, when my family left Kabul to Iran, and that's where I was born. I was born and raised as an Afghan refugee.
Mm-hmm.
Living in Iran as an Afghan refugee had its own challenges, made life difficult. So eventually we were able to move to Canada, and I'm grateful for that, because obviously we get here the kind of opportunities and the kind of life that we couldn't have had anywhere else.
Yeah.
In Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely.
In Iran, sorry, not in Iran and not in Afghanistan.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's just different levels of oppression, varying between those two countries. So, I mean, obviously, everyone has seen on the news that Joe Biden has begun the withdrawal. There were all sorts of horrific images on television of people trying to flee to the airport, women passing babies over to soldiers to attempt to give them away so that they could be taken outside of Afghanistan, given that the Taliban has taken Kabul. From your perspective, what is your take on the withdrawal, how it was done, whether that be President Joe Biden's response or in Canada with Justin Trudeau's response, or in my opinion, somewhat of a lack of response or very delayed response?
Yeah, so starting with what the local so Afghans experienced, I still have family and a lot of friends who are artists, journalists, authors, poets in Kabul, and the way this withdrawal was conducted obviously allowed for Taliban to take over Afghanistan and the major cities in such a short period of time. It even surprised those living in Afghanistan. And people, my friends who've they've been through, some of them have been through suicide bombings, and they've seen it all, but there's very little that surprises them, I think. But they're telling me that they were caught, they were blindsided, and they were completely surprised by how the withdrawal happened and how quickly Taliban were able to take over the whole country. And I think that speaks to, and obviously after that, reading, getting other perspectives and hearing, interviews with retired forces and other forces who've spoken to the withdrawal and how it was conducted. Obviously, there's a sense that this was a real failure in terms of how the withdrawal was executed. But also there is
I was going to say, it's one of those things where at the very least you would have expected a very well executed plan to evacuate all of those who helped Canadian or US armed forces during the war, because those people are the ones who are at extreme risk if they stay in Afghanistan. But all of these reports make it seem as if they forgot that they were there and now are left kind of trying to pick up the pieces in terms of who they need to get out and how they get them out and how are we going to get the planes there.
Yeah, and I'm getting, even from, you know, the pressers by President Biden, I'm getting a sense of indifference towards how what's happening there. And I imagine he probably had the same sense of the same indifference towards how the withdrawal was going to take place. And like many have pointed out, you don't give up your most strategic base in the entire country before you get your, at least before getting your diplomats and your citizens out, right? Bagram Air Base was so strategic from many perspectives, but also just for NATO and for America to have that complete control over that airbase. I'm just thinking, you know, how beneficial that would be and how helpful that would be right now with the situation we see in Kabul airport. And we see right now all these different countries and all these different forces are running, you know, because of that, you know, thousands and thousands of people just behind the gates of airport, and the Taliban security gates, which prevents a lot of people, which again, I hear from the locals there, they prevent a lot of people, especially younger people, to leave the country. Because of all those hurdles, now we see these individual forces going out to rescue missions, to get people through the gates and through that massive number of civilians outside of the gates, to get them to the airplanes. Obviously, having, you know, a second airbase, having Bagram would have been so helpful in this case. It would have literally saved thousands of lives. I mean, that's just one simple example of how terribly this withdrawal has been executed, because, you know, you want to have, if you know you're completely getting your forces out and you have diplomats and you have people at risk that worked for you and helped you out, you want to have a few options at least for them to get out of the country. Because right now it's completely chaotic. They have no control over, the forces have very little control over who gets through and who doesn't. And they're doing this from a very weak position, right? And that's what's hurting them in saving more people and saving American citizens.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, you would assume not only would they want multiple exit points, but one that was secure. Obviously, the Bagram airport would be far more secure and controlled, as opposed to what we're seeing in Kabul. My next question for you is really what happens next. So some have kind of posed the question, if we're on the verge of another refugee crisis, similar to Syria. Do you see that kind of unfolding? I mean, initial numbers at the gates would suggest that that's likely, but I'm not sure if you have a different ear to the ground as to the extent to which ordinary Afghan people will flee, much as they did in Syria.
So in terms of just comparing the two situations, like I don't know how successful Afghans actually will be to flee the country, because they're surrounded by, on one side there's Pakistan and Iran that have very, hostile hostile governments of their own, and the borders aren't exactly the best to cross. And on the north side, they have Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. So it's in a way it's sad, because they're kind of stuck in that, with that geography. That the advantage Syrians had was, like, being close to Europe and being close to countries that they could actually go through. So I don't know if we're going to see that same sort of flock of refugees coming out of the country, trying to go to other countries. And the other question is, like, where would they go, right? They have to go so far. They would have to go so far to get to a place that they would actually want to become a refugee in. Because again, like, the situation in Iran, Pakistan, and the other countries that they're surrounded by aren't exactly ideal.
Yeah, they're not safe. They're not countries that are necessarily safe to try and pass through en route to legitimately safe countries.
No, and to answer the other part of your question about how the Afghans there feel, and what is the mindset, what is the thinking right now, I can tell you from speaking to, like, directly to individual families and friends who have lived there their entire life. They didn't even get out the last time Taliban was around. And this time around, they just want to get out. And that's every single person that I speak to. They're the most patriotic people, from the most patriotic people to the most traditional people that I know in Afghanistan. They're just done with it. And everybody, I can tell you that if those people are looking for a way out, then I would say everybody who's not Taliban is trying to get out.
Yeah. And I mean, it begs the question of what countries like Canada and the United States can do. I would certainly be of the persuasion that we should do more in terms of helping these people flee. And I know a lot of people have been like, well, they need to be processed and all of that stuff. And those are all valid concerns. But in quoting Aaron O'Toole, when he was talking about the folks who worked for our armed forces, he said, well, let's just get them out of there and sort the paperwork out after. Let's focus with safety as the number one priority for these folks, and figure out the processing of this after the fact, whether it means they end up in Qatar or coming directly to countries like Canada and the United States. Basically load them up onto the planes, get them away from this atrocious regime, and figure out the paperwork after the fact, because ultimately so many of these people who stay, especially if they work with NATO forces, are likely to be killed if caught. And so I'm curious, just in the last few minutes we have, last minute here, if you're of the opinion as well that we should do more in terms of helping these folks get to safe countries, whether that be Canada, the United States, or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see that UK completely, publicly said it, that we don't even require the Afghan passport, because so many Afghans, or like families of the interpreters or NATO employees, their families didn't have passports, and with offices and banks and everything closed, they're unable to really get to that. So I completely agree. We have a lot of air bases around that, in that region, that they can get to. Unfortunately, Canada's been so focused on the bureaucracy, whether it was to get the planes into Kabul, to like get people out.
Mhm.
And we saw there were concerns about seat belts and whatnot. It's insane when you're trying to save, literally thousands and thousands of lives to be occupied with that sort of thing. We have the
Yeah.
resources, we can get them to air bases and then process the paperwork afterwards.
Well, Zahra, I really appreciate you joining us. We'll certainly have you on the show again as this continues to unfold. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me.